Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 8. Laura is observing a classroom. We had to reschedule a little bit because Tufts was closed yesterday morning due to snow. But Lisa and I are going to run you through everything. We've got Laura's comments, so we'll do our best to interpret them. One announcement this week is that there's spring break the week of March 19th. So there'll be no assignments, whatever that Friday is, through the 23rd. There won't be anything to do. So we're going to jump right into what we have as comments. We're going to start next week, or this week 8, we're going to ask you to pick your book that you're going to be doing with your students. We've seen lots of great options that you have put up there already. We're familiar with many of them, but some of them we're not. So we're going to ask you to pick your book, and if there's one that we haven't read, your TA or I will read it just so we can have a better discussion with you about it. And feel free to check in with us, either set up something on Skype or just to email back and forth if you're trying to figure out which book would be a good fit for your classroom. I just wanted to talk a little bit about books that we've seen that worked and not worked so well. I know we've touched on this. A couple of the books that everybody has talked about have survival themes, and those work really well and usually have tons of problems, small and big, that students can tackle and get really excited about. We've touched on fantasy books not being such a great fit, but definitely like James and the Giant Peach we saw work really well. I think it really has to do with the constraints that you give your students. Laying out at the very beginning, they can't use magic. Whatever else you think would be fitting for that for that book, that works pretty well. Is there anything you wanted to add, Lisa?
No, I was just ready to jump into some comments whenever you're ready.
Go ahead.
Good. Okay, so emails have been coming in, and as soon as I've been getting a new response, I've been trying to leave a little comment on it, and I wanted to touch on, I'm also circling back around again to some different assignments that have been rolling in as well, so I'll go back to the last probably 2-3 weeks and just kind of mention some things that I've noticed. So for the How to Apply Design Matrix in the Talk Science Primer, which was last week's assignment, when referring to the learning matrix, Eric brought up a good point. He said, in my own practice, I would first use this tool to assess where we as a whole class stand with regard to our design proficiency. When I first found this document, that's exactly what I did, Eric, so you are right on track. I think this is a great tool to keep in your classroom, and I think you can just kind of use it to gauge where your students are as we move through this process. This may be new to your students. I know it was new to my students last year, so I really loved using this tool, and I have mentioned that in the past as well. Kara also mentioned, I have a tendency to differentiate questions based on where each student is, asking the same open-ended question but providing different levels of scaffolding to help get a student to an answer. Students rarely get to say, I don't know, or get off the hook when asked a question in my room. I almost circle it back to them or support them until they can answer the question. In science, I hope this will move them from beginning design stages to the informed design stage. And my response, that was great, Kara. I thought that was excellent. As we assist our students in understanding a design challenge, using talk moves in group discussions is key. The Talk Science Primer supports the discourse move of revoicing. So basically, you're just kind of taking the students' words and revoicing them and maybe tweaking them a little bit to create academically productive talk. So students can hear what is being said, everyone is held accountable, and the conversation is focused and rigorous. I feel like the talk moves really helped me change kind of the way I had my discussions as a group. What you're trying to promote is an atmosphere that cultivates productive talk. You want to have those ground rules there, but you want you don't want the role to always be the teacher has to give all of the answers. I think when we use the talk moves, it gives the students more power, and it makes them, especially students who may not want to contribute, as they start contributing and realize that you're validating what they're saying, they're going to start to talk more. They're going to start speaking more in these group discussions. Katie mentioned that the students seem to be comfortable when they know that they, as a person, aren't being debated, but their idea is being debated. I really thought this is a great point to bring up as a class discussion. Debating thoughts, not people. That's a great discussion for you to have because it promotes that safe environment, again, to where productive talk is going to take place during your group discussions. And they're going to carry that over to their team discussions as well. They're going to value what other students say in a team and in a whole group, all in all productive talk, and that's what we're looking for.
All right. So I think this is a lot of, hopefully these two resources will give you a way to help shift student thinking. So we definitely want to understand students and what they're thinking. But our role as teachers and facilitators is to get them to shift so that they are able to consider all these other things as they're designing, and even if they're thinking about other people. I think there were a couple things people mentioned that were really great, like labeling prototypes helps them to start think a little bit more, not only help them lay out their ideas, but also to understand that part of what they're doing is communicating with others, whether it's somebody in their group or with a teacher, whoever it may be. And the communication, labeling, things like that, they really help their long-term goal. And somebody else also mentioned modeling. Both in conversations you're having with individual students and with the entire group. I think, Lisa, you touched on some of that, promoting productive talk. But I think that, the more kids can see that and the more they, you're affirming what they're doing, the more that you'll see it sort of seep into the culture of the classroom, hopefully in other places from when they're, just beyond where they're designing. Anything else to add to that article or those two? Before we move on, Lisa?
Nope.
Okay. So here are some comments from Laura. So let me see if we can figure this out. So this is going on to the science primer. And I don't know who this, I know she pulled a quote from somebody, but she didn't write who, that somebody had seen in step 4 of the backpack video. That the girls were rephrasing what they were trying to explain. She thinks this is really helpful for individual students to understand their ideas. Especially when they're working with a partner. Just read it. Whenever students are working with a partner, I like to ask them to explain the other person's ideas rather than explain their own. And this ensures that they're, one, paying attention to what their partner is thinking rather than jumping in with their own idea. And it, two, it really helps them understand the partner's design. I feel it's a really helpful method to encourage collaboration. I think that's great, and I think even on the James and the Giant Peach, when they're planning, there's a little bit of that. I know we have some other videos of them where really they're just spending a lot of time saying, what you're saying is, and then, no, what I meant was, and it really helped them to understand each other's ideas to have to repeat it back. And then here's another quote, but I don't know who it's from. I have been guilty of promoting what beginning designers do. I'm so glad you have learned something about your own teaching and thought about ways to improve it. And actually, maybe that is from Laura. So I think that is really good at understanding what beginning designers do as you support them as they move on, but definitely not feeling that they have to be stuck there, because kids, are capable of just doing so much. I think you're up next, Lisa.
Yep. Okay. There were some great comments for the Peach Lifter segment that we took a look at. Becky mentioned, I'm noticing that the student on the left is using a lot of gesturing to explain his ideas. It shows how talking out ideas can be more accessible than writing them down. I thought this was a great observation because this clip provides evidence that multiple forms of communication happen organically during engineering challenges. You're going to start to notice that it's just amazing to kind of sit back and watch what. Not only are they gesturing, but they're just so invested into their learning. These challenges bring out, sides of students that you may have not seen before. And I've noticed that in my own classroom, the change, and these kids are really, really invested to whatever that challenge is. And yes, you're going to notice that they're more animated and gestured because they're so excited about what they're doing. And to me, that was a great little thing that you noticed, Becky. Thank you for mentioning that. Kara also brought up that students are explaining sketches and they mentioned simple machines. My response to her is once teams have completed several sketches, they can meet with another team for feedback. With that feedback, they can choose which design they would like to move forward with, such as 2, 3, 5. Teams of 2 create 3 sketches and meet with another team for 5 minutes in order to gain peer feedback. Also, that's to me, the sketches, to meet with another team after sketches are created really helps push the students forward in making decision which design they're going to build.
Can I jump in?
And I also like that you mentioned. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to admit that's really great, and I think definitely the first time kids do that, it takes longer for them to explain what they're doing and get critique from the other group. But as they do it more, it'll take less time. So it can turn into like a 2-minute thing where one group shares their idea and gets feedback for like 1.5 minutes, and the other group does the same. So I think the more they're able to practice that and get feedback on what they're doing.
Yeah, it really should be more like.
Go ahead. Sorry.
It really should be like more like 2, 3, 20, because I've ever taken only 5 minutes in my class. But I remember reading about it a while ago, and that's what they called it, 235. I think it's intended to be just a quick, short thing. In my class is more than 5 minutes. It's such a great feedback session, collaboration, that I never cut it to 5 minutes, personally.
And then also what you were touching is just different ways for them to communicate. That some kids, are manipulating artifacts, so they actually need to have the materials as they're talking to their team member or their partner, because for them it would be impossible for them to explain what they're talking about just in words sometimes. It's sometimes hard because we say, like, okay, don't let them grab the materials until they start building, but some kids really need those materials to explain their ideas.
Yes, I agree. Also, Kara mentioned the differences before and after the Simple Machines unit. Kara brought up Simple Machines, and I wanted to talk about the differences that I saw in my class. Last year, when I first started novel engineering, I couldn't believe the differences in prototypes. Kids have that content knowledge. It's so much quicker for them to apply that to what prototypes they're building. So as soon as they learn about Simple Machines, I think from then on, every single novel engineering challenge, teams were using Simple Machines in their designs. So it's a clear, there's clearly evidence that they're integrating science and engineering, which is what we want to see. Go ahead, Alyssa?
Oh, that was just agree. That makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. The more content knowledge they can put into these designs, the better. I went back around and looked at some of our Chrisman responses, and there was a couple things. I wanted to mention something that Kathleen had brought up, and I forgot to mention during last week's video. Kathleen said, one of the principles that I really liked a lot was working creatively to generate design insights and solutions. I particularly resonated with this sentence. Helping students to learn to deal with uncertainty and to take productive risks while working with their ideas in creative ways can enhance such work. I think this idea resonated with me because this is something that is difficult to teach to students, but is critical to their success in not only engineering, but school as well. So many students learned early how to play the game of school, to say or to look for the right answer, and never push themselves to think, act, engage with learning outside of what is right. Teaching students how to take productive risks and think creatively is a difficult task because so many students are uncomfortable doing this. However, I think this is super necessary. I try to incorporate activities where I just want students to express what they know without feeling like there is a right answer. Any answer is valued. This is huge. To know that students' answers are valued, I think is so important, especially when we're taking on these types of challenges in the classroom. And not only by the teacher, but by their peers. When the class notices that the teacher is valuing a child's ideas, the students learn to do so as well. And we know that modeling is the best. But especially in these types of challenges, I think it's very important. By creating a safe space for this to happen, we encourage students to take productive risks, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. I found that by utilizing revoicing in the classroom, I'm able to step back from the traditional teacher-centered approach and instead hand the intellectual role over to the students. So this is just like what we were mentioning from the Talk Science Primer and the Learning Matrix. When we really want to start handing over some of the responsibility to the students, it all causes them to be more invested in their work, and you're going to see that you're going to see a maturity happen as you move down the spectrum. Let's see what else I said around.
So I completely agree with everything you say, and I think then starting to ask kids for evidence, not necessarily of every idea, but just like, why are you thinking this? Why are you saying this? Why do you think this design would work? And they'll start pulling from the book their evidence, basically, inferring something about a character or just something that they've experienced in their own life, and they start bringing that in and say, it worked in this situation at home, so I think this is why it would work here. Because most of the time, kids do have a reason for what they think is going to happen and what they want to design.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Let's see. I also circled back around to the backpack presentation comments. I know we touched upon that. Carol Beth said, I'm noticing that the girls certainly comprehend the problems within the story and have clearly demonstrated that their approach to design was driven from an empathetic perspective. They show understanding of their client, love the inconspicuous comment as the student described the making of the bag. Katie also mentioned the girls thought of their clients and the materials that would be available to those clients. The girls also considered the problems the characters in the book were facing, such as jingling, unorganized change, and possible future problems, such as needing to blend with the crowds at the museum so that the characters wouldn't be recognized and sent home. My response to both of you, great comments. I love to see that both of you picked up on that, because based on these comments and their prototype, it's evident that this team kept the end user in mind throughout the design process, which is going to bring up something Alyssa and I want to mention this week: empathy. Empathy is, I remember talking to my students about this last year and this year with my new class this year, and I guess when our students think of an engineer, they don't think of an engineer as being an empathetic person or an empathetic profession. And what they start to discover immediately with novel engineering, it is definitely a profession that is filled with empathy, because if an engineer doesn't have empathy towards their end user, how are they going to really be able to create a prototype or a design for them that's going to help solve a problem? They have to have that empathy. And I think that's key to what their designs are going to show. You're going to notice that more. And once the students start to get that, they start feeding off of one another. Alyssa and I were talking about that earlier. Alyssa, what were you saying? You had mentioned something too about, maybe it was a comment I read that you wrote. But what were you going to tell? You were going to say something about empathy.
I don't remember what that comment was. So one, I think that there are so many different ways that you just listed in some of people's comments that kids are being empathetic in the books and as they build, just that they're thinking about what kind of materials the characters would have and how they would use something. So it's just beyond like how do you feel about something, but we have in the PD guide that we sent you on page 61, I think there are 3 pages that have an empathy map and an example of one. But if you feel, obviously some kids are much better at this than others. So if you need to do something a little more structured with your students, we have that available. But I think it's really getting kids, especially those kids that need some help with that, to do that. And so just as sort of an aside, one of the ways we did this last year to sort of play around with the idea is we worked with a group of kids. This had nothing to do with novel engineering, but we were just doing user-centered design with autism spectrum disorder and having them build for somebody else. And we were really amazed that when that was the focus of what they were doing, they started, thinking about just, the kids that you were mentioning before, like how would the person use it? And would they be able to see this? And they weren't necessarily getting at how the person would feel using it. And I think that would also not really make sense in terms of what they were designing. But they were really able to think on a broad range about how something would be used. I think one example is they made clocks for people who have some sort of vision disability. So it was really important for them to, that it was the numbers were big enough, that they were contrasting color from the rest of the clock. There were a lot of things they thought about. How far away could somebody be from the clock? What kind of partial vision would you need to see it? But it really sparked some really great conversations. So I think that really this is a good focus for kids. All kids are able to do this. Just some need a little more support than others. Okay, so we're moving on. So I think the next thing we have are from Laura's comments. So one is from Charlotte, and this was the project she built. So there was an impressive multi-step water filter design system. And she did research on Sudan to learn about what materials they would have access to and try. It sounds like you were trying to limit yourself, Charlotte, to building with those materials. And I think that's another piece of the empathy we talked about, but that's something that comes up naturally as kids are designing from the books, that a lot of them try to stay in the historical time period or in the location that the characters are in and really try to make what they're building true to that situation. And one of the ways, especially let's say with Long Walk to Water, I don't remember if we touched on this, was that if they don't have the materials there that they might want to build with, how could you do it so it'd be really cheap to ship? So there are different ways to approach that problem, and different kids in a classroom either set it up differently, or as a class we've had people decide these are the constraints that everybody has to work from. And then Laura also commented on Paul's, that was a mosquito net pup tent, and then she said it was really fairly easy to build and quick. So I think one of the things that this brings up is if kids design something that really makes sense, that really works with the constraints and criteria, but they finish before everybody else, how can you deal with that? So one way to deal with that is to have, most of the time when kids say they are finished, they're not. It either isn't working properly or they really haven't addressed some of the changes they could make. But authentic testing will really help out with that, and really, if they really understand what the constraints and criteria are for their design, a lot of times it's really easy to go back and say, well, show me how it works. And then they start this narrative about how it's going to work, but they actually haven't made it work consistently. So to go back and say, okay, it worked once, let's see it a second time, to make sure it actually is working. And another way, if you really feel like they're not that, they haven't finished 2 hours ahead of everybody or half an hour ahead of everybody, is to the writing assignments. Either at the very end, they can go straight to that if you have like a culminating writing assignment, or their planning materials, whatever they're doing for that, just to have little pieces along the way for writing that they can spend a little more time with. Third way to do it is to have some sort of documentation that they're doing as they go, so they can also sort of balance their building with documenting what they are doing. So it can either be documented, there are a couple different ways, but one way could be, take a picture as you're building. If you have iPads, it's really easy to do that. There are a lot of free apps. If you're interested, just email. I can tell you what some of them are. And then you can talk about how the design changed, so that can become a focus. That we started out one way and we tested it and didn't work, so these are the changes we made. And so then it sort of becomes more of a game, like nobody's works the first time, but what did you do to address some of these changes that needed to happen, either through testing or if people were asking for, not asking for, but if in a feedback session, if you were given certain feedback, how did you address that? So that could even be a writing assignment in itself. Do you have anything to add from your own classroom, Lisa, for that?
Yes, for writing assignments, when I notice that some students are done before others, I have the teams come together to write a project description. And it takes some thought. They have to think about, okay, if you were describing, your product, what solution did you come up with? The problem, criteria that you established, what materials did you use, explain to the user how they would use this product. So it takes time. It's definitely something that will take a little time for them to do. I wish they all had time to get to this at the end, and oftentimes I try to make every team do that, but some teams take a little bit more time to build than others. So I adjust with that as I go, but that's a nice little writing clip.
And that's sort of a nice lead-in what we're going to talk about in a few weeks, assessment, but just to start thinking about it now. There's so many different ways you can assess students. It's not necessarily like their design works or it doesn't work. If you're looking at their reading and everything that you would, the standards you would typically look at there, you're looking at the writing. And then for engineering and design, they can reflect on how they participated in the engineering design project, how well their solution met the needs of the client. It can either be like through a design journal or a portfolio, or it can just be, either orally or with some sort of written task. But it's all, I think portfolios are a great way to keep track of what the students are are doing. So we want you in the next couple weeks to think a little bit more about that. And for one of your assignments for this week, it's going to be to brainstorm about that and just really do a couple bullet points. So the main assignment this week is to fill out that planning document. You did one section of materials for this past week, but we really want you this time to go through, pick a book, and really start playing around with some of the ideas as you implement it in your class and as you're planning for it. So as you're picking a book, we want you to email us and tell us what that book is so we can make sure one of us has read it so we can have a conversation about it. But walk through that planning document, so you're going to start to think like your students and anticipate some of the problems that they are going to come up with, some of the materials they might want to use. So I think that'll walk you through the 9 steps. Don't come up with a specific timeline for this week's assignment, so you're just doing portions 1 through 7. Number 8 is assessment, so just a couple of bullet points to brainstorm. And then number 9, we really just want to know when you're going to read the book and when you think you're going to build with your students, but you don't need to go into detail about it. Another assignment for this week is to read a chapter, and this is on a book, Trudy Adderley, Champion of the World. And it's a pretty short chapter, but it's looking at how one teacher implemented a unit in her classroom, and it has some of her reflections throughout the chapter. So we want you to sort of see and understand a little bit of what she was thinking as she was designing the chapter. And then you also get to see how some of the kids did it. And the video from this week has to do with that classroom, so you'll actually see a video from one of the transcripts in the chapter. And then we want you to write a reflection on the chapter. So as you're looking at the video on Torch, We want to make sure you're commenting on what the students are doing and getting at their ideas. But then when you do your written reflection on the chapter, we want you to think a little bit more about what the teacher's doing and some of her decisions. And we're not asking you to critique what she's doing, but really to reflect on her choices. And this might lead you to think about things that you hadn't thought about for your own classroom. But hopefully you'll understand a little bit more of what she's doing. So that's the first half of that written response. It's just a few paragraphs. And the second half of it is how can you carry over what you've been reading and looking at this week into your own classroom. Anything you want to add, Lisa?
No, just keep turning in. If you have any assignments that you haven't gotten to, keep turning them in. I keep going back and checking over them. You have some great things to share. I don't mind looking back. I love to see what people are commenting on one another's, reflections. So great work. You guys have some great work that you're handing in. I love to read what you've been doing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all the comments are just really exciting, and everybody seems to really get what's going on and looking at students. So we want to make sure we are supporting you as much as possible to make sure you take what you're learning and what you know about your students and are able to implement it. So if you feel like there's something that's missing, please let us know, and we can, either read an article, make a quick sheet for you, share a little bit more of what we've seen, whatever we think or you think would help you. So I think that is it for this week. All right, thank you guys very much. Bye-bye.